The wind had a bite that gnawed straight through to the bone, a relentless scavenger that had followed the stagecoach for the last 100 miles. When the wheels finally ceased their groaning protest against the frozen ruts of Larkspur Hollow's main street, the silence that followed was heavier than the noise had been. For May Whitlock, it was the silence of an ending, and perhaps the terrifying quiet of a beginning. She descended from the coach, her body a single, unified ache. Every joint screamed from the jolting journey, and the cold air was a slap to a face already chapped raw by the wind. She clutched the handle of her worn leather medical chest, its brass corners dulled with age and its weight a familiar anchor in a world that had become unmoored. It was all she had left of her old life. That and the faint, silver line that circled her right wrist, a scar she kept hidden beneath the cuff of her woolen sleeve. It was a private map of a past she had traveled far to escape. Larkspur Hollow wasn't much more than a wound in the vast, unforgiving landscape. A single street, churned to a thick mud that was just beginning to freeze, was flanked by a dozen or so wooden buildings leaning against each other for support. A general store, a saloon from which a tinny piano tune leaked like a dripping faucet, and a smithy, its rhythmic clang the town's only heartbeat. Smoke curled from stone chimneys, thin and gray against a sky the color of slate. This was the edge of the map, the place they sent people who didn't fit anywhere else. May had been a nurse, a good one, with the Eastern Patrol. She knew how to set a bone, stitch a wound, and brew a willow bark tea that could break the most stubborn fever. But her hands, though steady with a needle, sometimes trembled when she slept. They saw the tremor, not the steadiness. They saw the quiet sorrow in her eyes, not the resilience that kept her standing. Too fragile for this life. Miss Whitlock, the captain had said, his words a dismissal coated in a thin veneer of concern. They had called it a reassignment, a post in a quieter territory. It felt like an exile. So they had put her on a coach heading west, with a one-way ticket and a hollow feeling in her chest that the rattling of the wheels couldn't shake loose. The boarding house was run by a woman named Martha Gable, whose face was a roadmap of hard winters. She looked May up and down, her gaze lingering on the medical chest. Rooms at the top of the stairs, $2 a week. Supper's at 6. Don't be late. There was no warmth in her voice, only the flat finality of a business transaction. The room was small, clean, and cold. It held a narrow bed with a patchwork quilt, a washstand with a pitcher and bowl, and a single window that looked out over the bleak expanse of the northern plains. The wind rattled the glass, a lonely sound. May set her chest down at the foot of the bed, the thud echoing in the small space. She didn't unpack. She simply sat on the edge of the mattress, her hands folded in her lap, and let the weariness wash over her in a great, gray wave. She had run so far, but the ghost of her past had ridden in the coach right beside her. Later, drawn by the smell of roasting meat and the promise of warmth, she made her way downstairs to the common room. A fire crackled in a large stone hearth, casting dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls. A few men sat around a table, their voices low and gravelly. Martha Gable ladled a thick stew into bowls without a word. May took a seat in a corner, hoping to be invisible, a ghost at the feast. She ate slowly, the hot stew a comfort to her chilled body. She listened to the men's talk, the way a person lost in the woods listens for the sound of water. They spoke of cattle prices, of the coming snow, of a broken axle on the freight wagon from Sterling. It was the mundane, everyday talk of men whose lives were tethered to the land and the seasons. Then, one of the men, a wiry fellow with a thick mustache, leaned forward, lowering his voice. Heard Harlow was in town this morning. Rode in, got supplies. Didn't say 10 words to a soul. Another man, older and broader, grunted. He ever does man's more shadow than substance. May kept her eyes on her stew, but her ears strained to catch every word. There was a change in the room's atmosphere, a subtle shift from casual talk to something heavier. laced with a mixture of fear and grudging respect. "They say he's got the devil's own luck," the first man continued, his voice barely a whisper now. "Remember that business with the Miller brothers last spring tried to raid his horse herd?" The third man at the table, who had been silent until now, spoke up. His voice was steady, factual, as if recounting a known history. "It wasn't luck. It was just Harlow. The Millers had him cornered by the canyon. 3 of them, all armed. Harlow had that old colt of his. They found the brothers the next day. All 3 of them." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle in the room. "Coroner said they were all taken down by the same bullet. Went through the first one's neck, caught the second in the chest, and shattered the third one's arm so bad he bled out before he could crawl away." A thick silence fell over the table. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the wind howling outside. 1 bullet, 3 men, the math didn't seem possible. It was the kind of story that grows in the telling, a piece of folklore forged in the harsh realities of the frontier. May felt a chill that had nothing to do with the draft from the door. She had seen violence. She had tended to its brutal aftermath, cleaned the wounds, and whispered comfort to dying men. She knew what a bullet could do to a man, but this story was different. It spoke of a cold, terrifying efficiency. It spoke of a man who was not just a fighter, but a force of nature, as untamed and dangerous as the land itself. "The man's unnatural," the mustached man finally breathed. "Lives all alone out there in that north ranch. Breeds the best horses in the territory. But you'd be a fool to try and get close. He's broken. Mean." "He's not mean," the older man countered, his voice thoughtful. "He's just done with people, done with talk. Can't say I blame him." May finished her stew, the food now a tasteless lump in her stomach. Jonas Harlow. The name echoed in her mind. The man from the North Ranch, a man who could end 3 lives with a single piece of lead. She instinctively pulled her sleeve further down, covering the faint, silver scar on her wrist. She knew about being broken. She knew about being done with people. The men at the table spoke of him as a monster, a local legend to be feared. But as she sat there, a stranger in a strange town, all she could feel was a flicker of something she hadn't felt in a long time, a profound and terrifying curiosity. She had come to Larkspur Hollow to escape the ghosts of her past, but she had a sudden, sinking feeling she had just heard the name of a new one. The first week in Larkspur Hollow was a lesson in shades of gray. The sky, the mud, the weathered faces of the townsfolk all seemed drained of color, bleached by a relentless wind that promised a hard winter. May learned that survival here was a quiet, stubborn affair. People kept to themselves, their kindnesses small and practical, their suspicions large and unspoken. She spent her days in the small, cold room, sorting through her medical chest, taking inventory of her dwindling supplies of laudanum, carbolic acid, and quinine. The silver scar on her wrist seemed to mock her, a constant reminder of why she was here, in this place that felt like the world's last, forgotten corner. But inaction was a poison May could not abide. It left too much room for memories to fester. She had a skill, a purpose, and she saw the need for it in the gaunt faces of the children and the tired slump of the women's shoulders. She started not in the town proper, but on its frayed edges, in the collection of ramshackle lean-tos and dugouts where the poorest families lived, the ones who couldn't afford the town doctor's coin or pride. Her first visits were met with closed doors and wary eyes. She offered her services for free, asking only for a bit of bread or a few eggs in return, if they could spare them. She didn't preach or condescend. She simply knelt by a child shivering with fever, bathed his forehead with cool water, and administered a dose of diluted willow bark tincture. She showed a mother how to make a poultice of bread and milk to draw out the infection from a splinter. She spoke in low, soothing tones, and her hands, when they worked, were sure and gentle. Slowly, a fragile trust began to form. A door would open before she knocked, A woman would offer her a cup of weak, chicory coffee. They began to call her the quiet nurse. The name fit. She rarely spoke unless it was to give instruction or comfort. Her own story remained a locked room, and they respected her silence. For they all had rooms of their own they kept locked. It was on one of these missions, a fortnight after her arrival, that the world tilted on its axis. She was returning from the Cowboy shack, situated farthest north of the settlement, almost halfway to the brooding hills where the Harlow Ranch was said to be. The Calloway's youngest, a boy of 3 named Samuel, was struggling with a croupy cough that rattled his small frame. May had left them with a jar of honey and horehound syrup she'd prepared, promising to return in 2 days. The wind was a physical force, pushing against her, trying to steal the breath from her lungs. She had her head down, her shawl pulled tight, one hand gripping the handle of her medical chest. The earth was hard and unforgiving under her worn boots. It was this focus on her own small battle against the elements that made her oblivious to the danger until it was too late. A heavy freight wagon, pulled by a team of 6 mules, was rumbling toward town along the main track. The driver, bundled against the cold, cracked his whip, the sound sharp and sudden like a gunshot. The sound spooked a lone horse tied to a hitching post outside a nearby sod house. It was a rangy, wild-eyed gelding that belonged to no one in particular. With a terrified snort, the horse reared, snapping the frayed rope that held it. It happened in a heartbeat. The horse, panicked and blind, bolted directly into May's path. There was no time to scream, no time to run. She looked up and saw a wall of panicked flesh and flying hooves. She threw her arm up instinctively to protect her face as the horse's shoulder slammed into her. The impact sent her spinning. Her medical chest flew from her grasp, landing with a heavy thud in the frozen mud. May herself was thrown to the ground, the air knocked from her lungs in a painful gasp. She landed hard on her side, her head striking the unforgiving earth. For a moment, the world was a dizzying blur of gray sky and brown mud. The panicked horse was already a diminishing shape in the distance, galloping wildly across the plain. Pain bloomed, sharp and immediate. Her hip, her shoulder, and a stinging raw scrape along the back of her right hand where the gravelly dirt had torn the skin. She lay there for a moment, catching her breath, the metallic taste of fear in her mouth. She pushed herself up slowly, first to her elbows, then to a sitting position. The world swam back into focus. Her chest. She had to get to her chest. The glass bottles inside were precious, irreplaceable out here. She crawled the few feet to where it lay, relief washing over her as she saw it was intact, only muddied. Her hand throbbed, and when she looked down, she saw it was bleeding freely, the torn skin packed with dirt and small bits of gravel. Infection was a swift and deadly enemy in this land. Ignoring the ache in the rest of her body, she worked the latches on her chest with her good hand. Her movements were automatic, the familiar ritual of her profession a steadying force in the chaotic aftermath of the fall. She pulled out a small bottle of carbolic acid, a roll of clean linen bandages, and a pair of tweezers. She sat there, in the middle of the cold, lonely track, and began to tend to her own wound with painstaking focus. She used the tweezers to pick the larger pieces of grit from the scrape. The pain was sharp, but she bit her lip and continued, her brow furrowed in concentration. Then, she uncorked the carbolic acid and poured a small amount onto a strip of linen, hesitating only for a second before pressing it to the wound to clean it. She hissed as it stung, a clean, fiery pain that promised to burn away the danger. She was so engrossed in her task, in the small, controllable world of her own injury, that she didn't hear the approaching hoofbeats until they stopped just a few feet away. A shadow fell over her, slowly, fighting the stiffness in her neck. She looked up. It was a man on a magnificent black horse, a creature of midnight and muscle that seemed to absorb the pale light of the afternoon. The man himself was one with the horse and the landscape. He was tall in the saddle, broad-shouldered, wearing a heavy sheepskin coat against the cold. A low-brimmed hat shadowed his face, but she could see the hard line of his jaw and a face weathered not just by the sun and wind, but by something deeper, something that had carved its lines from the inside out. He looked down at her, and his eyes, visible from under the brim of his hat, were the color of a winter sky just before a storm. They missed nothing. He said nothing. He simply watched her, his expression unreadable. May felt a flush of humiliation. A woman sitting in the dirt, tending to her own wounds like some stray animal. He must think she was a beggar, or worse. Her clothes were plain, her face smudged with dirt from the fall. She expected a sneer, a dismissive command to get out of the road. But his gaze wasn't contemptuous. It was appraising. It moved from her disheveled form to the open medical chest beside her, its contents neatly arranged. It lingered on the methodical, practiced way she was now wrapping the clean linen around her bleeding hand, her fingers moving with an economy and skill that spoke of long practice. He saw not a victim, but a survivor, competently handling a bad situation. He saw the way she ignored the pain, her focus absolute. He shifted slightly in the saddle, the leather creaking in the immense silence. His presence was overwhelming, a stark and vital force in the empty landscape. May's heart hammered against her ribs. She recognized the aura around him, the one she'd heard in the whispers at the boarding house. This was him, Jonas Harlow, the man who had faced down 3 men with a single bullet. She finished tying off the bandage, her fingers trembling slightly now that the task was done. She braced herself for his words, certain they would be harsh. He finally spoke, and his voice was what she had imagined, low and rough, as if it hadn't been used in a long time. It was the sound of stones grinding together. He didn't smile. His face remained a mask of stoic neutrality. He didn't ask if she was hurt or if she needed help. His gaze was fixed on her, or perhaps on the medical chest beside her. "Do you have anything for a fever?" he asked. The question was stark, stripped of all pleasantry, a direct and urgent need cutting through the cold air between them. For a long moment, May couldn't find her voice. The question hung in the air, so contrary to what she'd expected that it disarmed her completely. Her mind raced. A fever. He was the fearsome Jonas Harlow, the solitary rancher, the subject of dark town legends. And he was asking her for medicine. The aches and pains from her fall receded, replaced by the sharp focus of her training. A need had been presented. Her purpose was to meet it. She looked from his unreadable face down to her medical chest, then back up at him. "I do," she said, her own voice sounding small against the vast emptiness of the plains. "I have quinine and willow bark. Who is it for?" He ignored her question. His gaze swept the horizon, a quick, assessing glance at the darkening sky. The clouds that had been a dull, flat gray all day were now churning, thickening with a purpose that promised more than just a passing chill. Small, hard flakes of snow had begun to fall, not the gentle, picturesque kind, but a stinging prelude to a real storm. "Can you ride?" he asked, his tone leaving no room for argument. It was not a question of comfort, but of capability. May looked at his horse, a powerful animal that stood a full hand taller than any she was used to. Her hip throbbed in protest at the mere thought. I'm not sure," she stammered, hating the weakness in her voice. Without another word, he swung his leg over the saddle and dismounted in one fluid motion. He was taller on the ground than she'd imagined, a man built of lean muscle and hard resolve. He walked over to her medical chest, lifted it as if it weighed nothing, and strapped it securely behind his saddle. Then he turned back to her. May instinctively flinched, expecting him to grab her, to haul her up like a sack of feed. Instead, he simply stood before her, waiting. "The snow is coming fast," he said, his voice flat. "The Calloway place is an hour's walk back, and you'll freeze before you get halfway to town. My ranch is closer." It wasn't an invitation. It was a statement of fact. She had two choices: stay here and likely perish in the coming storm, or trust the man they called a monster. The silver scar on her wrist tingled with a phantom ache, a reminder of misplaced trust. But then she looked at his eyes again. They were hard. Yes, but they were also direct. There was no deceit in them. There was only a stark, brutal honesty. May pushed herself to her feet, biting back a groan as her bruised hip protested. She swayed for a moment, and his hand shot out, not to grab her, but to steady her elbow. His touch was brief, impersonal, yet a strange warmth spread from the point of contact. It was the first human touch she'd felt in weeks that wasn't clinical or accidental. She quickly regained her balance, and he withdrew his hand as if the contact had burned him. He mounted his horse, then looked down at her, offering a gloved hand. "Come on." She hesitated for a final second, then placed her hand in his. His grip was firm, strong, and he easily pulled her up, settling her in front of him on the saddle. It was an awkward, unnervingly intimate arrangement. She was pressed against his chest, the rough sheepskin of his coat abrasive against her cheek. She could feel the solid wall of his body, the slow, steady rhythm of his breathing. He smelled of pine, leather, and the cold winter air. He nudged the horse forward into a steady walk, heading not back toward town but north, into the teeth of the strengthening wind. The snow was falling faster now, a thick, swirling curtain that quickly obscured the track behind them. They were alone, two small figures in a vast, whitening world. May huddled into herself, trying to make herself smaller, acutely aware of the man who was a silent, brooding presence behind her. She thought of the stories, of the three men and the single bullet. She thought of his strange, urgent question, and she wondered what kind of trouble she had just ridden into. The journey was a blur of biting wind and swirling snow. Jonas said nothing, his focus entirely on navigating the increasingly treacherous landscape. He seemed to know every dip and rise of the land by instinct. Just when May thought she could endure the cold no longer, a dark shape loomed out of the white chaos, a long, low ranch house, built of thick, dark timbers, with a sturdy barn and a series of corrals nearby. Smoke rose from a stone chimney, a welcome sign of life and warmth. He rode them directly into the barn, the sudden stillness and relative warmth a shocking relief. The air inside was thick with the scent of hay and horses. He dismounted, then reached up to help her down. Her legs were stiff and numb, and she nearly stumbled, but he steadied her again, his hands on her waist for a fraction of a second longer than necessary before he released her. He unstrapped her medical chest and handed it to her. "Wait here," he commanded, then disappeared into the storm, leading his horse toward a different part of the barn. May stood there, shivering, clutching her chest. She was in Jonas Harlow's barn, a place no one from town ever dared to venture. A few horses shifted in their stalls, their soft snorts and the rustle of hay the only sounds. A few moments later, he returned, his shoulders dusted with snow. "This way." He led her out of the barn and across a short, wind-swept path to the house. The door opened into a large main room, dominated by a massive stone fireplace where a low fire was burning. The room was sparse, masculine, and impeccably clean. A long wooden table with two benches, a few shelves holding tins and supplies, a gun rack on the wall holding a rifle and a shotgun. It was the home of a man who owned nothing he didn't need. He gestured toward the fire. "Get warm." Then he disappeared through a doorway, leaving her alone. May crept closer to the hearth, holding her numb hands out to the flames. The warmth was a painful, prickling sensation as the feeling returned to her fingers. She looked around the room, taking in the details. There were no pictures, no decorations, nothing to suggest a life beyond mere survival. It was a fortress, not a home. Jonas returned, carrying a lit oil lamp. "The fever is in here," he said, nodding toward the room he'd just left. It was a bedroom, the patient, Whoever it was in his own bed. She followed him, her nurse's instincts taking over. The room was just as sparse as the main one. A large wooden bed, a small table, and a wooden chest. A young boy, perhaps 10 or 11, was lying in the bed. His face flushed and his breathing shallow. He was tangled in the blankets, shivering despite the heat radiating from his skin. "My nephew, Silas," Jonas said, his voice softer now, stripped of its harsh edge. "My sister, she passed 2 winters ago. He's all I have." The admission was so unexpected, so deeply personal, that it struck May with the force of a physical blow. This solitary, fearsome man was a guardian, a caregiver. She immediately went to the boy's side, placing a cool hand on his forehead. He was burning up. "How long has he been like this?" she asked, her voice all business. 2 days. It's getting worse." For the next hour, there was no fear, no awkwardness. There was only the patient and the nurse. May worked with quiet efficiency. Jonas, her silent, watchful assistant. She had him fetch clean water and rags. She administered a dose of quinine, crushing the bitter pill in a spoonful of water and gently coaxing the boy to swallow it. She bathed Silas's face and chest with cool water, speaking to him in a low, calming murmur, though he was mostly delirious. Jonas stood in the corner of the room, a silent sentinel, watching her every move with an intensity that was almost unnerving. He saw the confidence in her actions, the gentleness in her touch, the deep well of competence she drew from. Finally, the boy's shivers subsided, and his breathing deepened into the steady rhythm of a true sleep. His fever had not broken, but the worst of the crisis seemed to have passed. May straightened up, her back aching. "He needs to be watched. The fever may rise again during the night." Jonas simply nodded, his eyes fixed on the sleeping boy. She returned to the main room, her body suddenly remembering its own aches and exhaustion. The storm was now a full-blown blizzard, a howling fury outside the sturdy log walls. There was no question of her leaving tonight. Jonas came out of the bedroom, closing the door softly behind him. He gestured to another door she hadn't noticed before. "You can stay in there." He opened it to reveal a small, windowless room, clearly meant for storage. It contained a narrow cot with a clean but thin mattress and a folded blanket. It was nothing more than a space, but it was sheltered and private. "It has no window," he said, as if apologizing for the fact. "But it's warm. The chimney runs behind this wall." May looked at the small, dark space. In her old life, she would have found it claustrophobic, confining. Now, it felt like a sanctuary, a place to be alone with her exhaustion. She nodded, unable to speak past the lump of fatigue in her throat. Later, after a silent meal of bread and salted pork that Jonas had prepared, May retreated to the small room. She placed the oil lamp he'd given her on the floor, the only piece of furniture besides the cot. The blizzard raged outside, its muffled howls a constant reminder of the wildness of this place, and of the man who inhabited it. She sat on the edge of the cot, the events of the day washing over her, the fall, the encounter, the frantic ride through the snow, the sick child, and the man who was so much more complicated than the stories told about him. The lamplight flickered, casting long, dancing shadows. Light was a fragile thing, easily extinguished. She reached down and turned the wick lower, softening the flame's harsh glare to a gentle, golden glow. The soft light made the small room feel less like a cell and more like a cocoon. She heard the floorboards creak outside her door. Jonas was standing there, a silhouette in the doorway, checking on her before he settled in a chair by his nephew's bedside for the night. In the quiet intimacy of the lamp-lit room, a question rose in her, unbidden. It was the oldest, most fundamental question, the one that had haunted her since the day she'd received the scar on her wrist. She looked at the formidable shape of the man in her doorway, a man capable of legendary violence, yet who had shown her a practical, undemanding kindness. Her voice was barely a whisper, almost lost in the sound of the storm. "Am I safe?" Jonas Harlow stood there for a long moment, the silence stretching between them. His face was in shadow, but she could feel the weight of his gaze. He didn't offer false platitudes or easy comforts. He didn't tell her that nothing bad would ever happen again. He offered her the only truth he had. He looked straight at her, his voice a low, solid vow in the darkness. "With me," he said, and it was enough. A breath she didn't know she'd been holding escaped her lips. She nodded. Once, a small gesture of acceptance, and as he turned to begin his long vigil, she watched the low, steady flame of the lamp, its light a small but defiant beacon against the vast and howling dark. The blizzard imprisoned them for 3 days. It was a world reduced to the thick log walls of the house, the roaring of the wind, and the small, vital tasks of survival. The passage of time was marked not by the sun, which had vanished behind a wall of white, but by the rhythm of Silas's fever. May and Jonas fell into an unspoken partnership, a silent dance choreographed by necessity. May was the keeper of the sick room. She rarely left the boy's side, changing his sweat-soaked sheets, bathing his hot skin, and spooning thin broth and willow bark tea between his cracked lips. Jonas was the keeper of the fortress. He kept the fire fed from a large pile of wood stacked against the indoor wall, melted snow for water, and moved about his chores with a quiet, restless energy. He would disappear for long stretches to the barn to tend his horses, returning with a fresh dusting of snow on his shoulders and the sharp scent of the cold clinging to him. They spoke very little. Words were an unnecessary currency. "More water," she would say, and a full bucket would appear. "He needs to eat," he would state, and she would nod, already preparing the broth. In the long hours of the night, they would take turns sitting in the chair by Silas's bed. When May's turn came, she would often find a mug of hot, bitter coffee waiting for her on the hearth, left there by a silent benefactor. On the morning of the 3rd day, the fever broke. May was dozing in the chair when Silas stirred, his eyes fluttering open. They were clear for the first time, free of the delirious haze. "Aunt May," he whispered, his voice weak and raspy. He had mistaken her for someone else in his fevered dreams. "It's May," she corrected gently, smoothing the hair back from his damp forehead. "You've been very sick, Silas." He looked around the room, then at Jonas, who stood in the doorway, his large frame filling it completely. A small smile touched the boy's lips. "Uncle Jonas." Jonas didn't smile back, but a visible tension eased from his shoulders. He just nodded, a single, sharp gesture of acknowledgement, before turning and walking back into the main room. The crisis was over. With Silas sleeping peacefully, a deep and healing slumber, the immense space of the house suddenly felt small and confining. The silence, which had been a shared space of work and worry, now felt heavy, awkward. May found herself watching Jonas more closely. She was a nurse. Observation was her most honed skill, and she began to notice something she had been too preoccupied to see before. There was a stiffness in his walk, a slight hesitation before he put his full weight on his left leg. He favored it, a subtle, almost imperceptible limp that he tried to conceal with a controlled, rigid posture. When he rose from a sitting position, he would use the table for leverage, a quick, disguised movement. When he carried a heavy load of firewood, his stride became more pronouncedly uneven. May's mind sifted through the fragments of gossip she'd heard at the boarding house. Asterisk, the business with the Miller brothers last spring. No, that was too long ago for a wound to still be troubling him this badly, unless it had been a devastating one. Then she recalled another part of the conversation, something one of the men had said more recently. A stagecoach robbery. Just last month. He'd intercepted it. The story was less clear, less legendary than the one about the single bullet, but it had involved a fight. She said nothing. She knew better than to pry. Men like Jonas Harlow built walls around their pain. To ask about it was to attack the wall, and he would only build it higher. So she watched and she waited. The storm began to abate on the 4th day. The wind's howl softened to a mournful sigh, and a pale, watery light began to filter through the grimy windows. The world was still a landscape of white, but the immediate violence of the blizzard had passed. The woodpile inside was running low, and Jonas pulled on his heavy coat and gloves to venture out to the main woodshed. May was standing by the window, watching the strange, sculpted shapes the snowdrifts had made against the barn. When she saw him coming back, he was carrying a huge load of split logs in his arms, his head bent against the wind. He was halfway to the house when his left leg suddenly buckled. It wasn't a dramatic fall. It was a sickening, uncontrolled lurch. He staggered, catching himself at the last second. But several logs tumbled from his arms into the deep snow. He stood there for a moment, motionless, his back to the house. May saw his shoulders tense, a rigid line of frustration and pain. Then, slowly, deliberately, he bent down to retrieve the fallen logs, his movement stiff and labored. That was all she needed to see. When he came inside, stamping the snow from his boots, she was waiting for him. A basin of hot water steaming on the hearth and clean linen strips laid out on the table beside her medical chest. He stopped just inside the door, his eyes narrowing with suspicion as he took in the scene. He dropped the wood into the log bin with a loud clatter. "Silas is sleeping," she said quietly. "His color is good. I saw," he bit out. Not looking at her, he started to unbutton his coat. "You need to sit down. Mr. Harlow." He froze, his hand on a button. He turned his head slowly and pinned her with a look of pure, cold fury. "I'm fine." "No," she said, her voice soft but unyielding. "You're not. Your leg is injured, badly, from the look of it. An old wound that hasn't healed properly. It's inflamed. If you don't let me look at it, you're going to lose the leg. Or your life." She laid out the facts as she would to any patient, with clinical detachment, stripping the emotion from her words to leave only the hard, undeniable truth. He stared at her, his jaw tight, a storm more violent than the one outside gathered in his eyes. He was a man who had never accepted help, had never shown weakness. To do so now, in front of this quiet woman who had seen the only other vulnerable part of his life, his nephew, was an agony of pride. For a full minute, he said nothing, and May thought he would order her out of his house, out into the snow, to take her chances with the wilderness. Then, with a low growl of sound that was part curse, part sigh of defeat, he limped to the table and sank heavily onto the bench. It was a surrender. May didn't allow herself to feel triumph, only a quiet sense of purpose. She knelt on the floor in front of him, a position of subservience that was, in fact, one of complete control. "I need you to roll up your trouser leg," she said. He did, his movements jerky and reluctant. He exposed a thick, woolen undergarment, and then, as he pushed that up, the injury itself. May drew a sharp, quiet breath. It was worse than she'd thought. The area around his calf was a swollen, angry mass of tissue. The skin was stretched tight and shiny, mottled with shades of red and a sickening, bruised purple. In the center was a ragged, puckered scar, clearly from a deep gash, and around it, the flesh was hot to the touch. The wound had healed over on the surface, trapping the infection deep within. "A knife?" she asked, her fingers gently probing the hot, tight skin around the wound. He flinched but didn't pull away. "Yes," he grunted. "During that stagecoach mess last month. Didn't think it was this bad." "You were wrong," she said simply. She looked up at his face. It was a pale, stoic mask, but she could see a fine sheen of sweat on his brow, and the tiny muscle that jumped in his clenched jaw. He was in more pain than he would ever admit. "This is going to hurt," she stated. "I have to open it, to let it drain." He gave a curt, single nod. "Do it." She worked with the same methodical calm she'd shown with Silas. She cleaned the area with carbolic acid, the sharp, medicinal smell filling the air. Then she took a small, sharp scalpel from her kit. She didn't hesitate. Her hand was steady as she made a quick, deep incision along the old scar line. Jonas's entire body went rigid. A low, guttural sound was torn from his throat. But he didn't move. He didn't cry out. He just stared at the far wall, his knuckles white where he gripped the edge of the table. The release of pressure was immediate and foul. May worked quickly, cleaning the wound with a grim focus, her face impassive. She packed it with a clean strip of linen soaked in antiseptic to allow it to continue draining, then began to bandage it tightly with fresh wrappings. His silence was immense, a testament to a will forged in unimaginable hardship. He had borne it alone for weeks. When she was finished, she cleaned her instruments and washed her hands. She prepared a poultice of bread and boiled milk, a simple remedy to draw out the remaining poison, and gently applied the warm, soft mash to the bandaged area. His leg was still tense under her touch, but some of the rigid fury had gone out of him, replaced by a profound exhaustion. She stood up, her own knees aching. He was still staring at the wall, his breathing harsh. "You need to stay off it," she said, "and I'll need to change the dressing twice a day. It will take time, but it will heal properly now." He didn't answer for a long time. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the drip of melting snow from the eaves outside. The world was slowly, quietly, coming back to life. Finally, he spoke, his voice rough. "The snow will be clear enough for the road to town by tomorrow." It wasn't a question. It was a statement, a dismissal. He had gotten what he needed from her. His nephew was well, his own life no longer in immediate danger. Her purpose here was finished. May felt a familiar, hollow ache in her chest. She had been useful. Now she was not. It was the story of her life. She simply nodded, turning away to put her medical supplies back in their chest, preparing for her departure. "I'll leave in the morning, then." She began to close the lid of her chest, but his voice stopped her. "Don't!" She turned back. He was looking at her now, his gaze direct and intense. The anger was gone, replaced by something she couldn't name. It wasn't gratitude. It was something more complex, something akin to a grudging acknowledgement. "The boy, Silas, he likes having you here," he said, the words costing him an obvious effort. "And the leg, you said it needs dressing." He was offering reasons, excuses. What he was not saying, what a man like him could never say, was that he had grown used to her presence. He had grown used to the quiet way she moved about his house, her calm competence a soothing balm on the raw, solitary edges of his life. He had grown used to the shared silence, a silence that wasn't empty, but full of a peaceful, unspoken understanding. May looked at him, at this hard, broken man who had just allowed her past his formidable defenses. She looked at the closed door to Silas's room. She looked at the fire burning steadily in the hearth, the boarding house room, with its cold floor and lonely window, seemed a world away. She didn't answer him with words. She simply walked back to the table, opened her medical chest again, and placed the bottle of carbolic acid back on the shelf. The gesture was her reply. "I am staying." Jonas watched her, then gave another one of his short, sharp nods. He leaned his head back against the wall and closed his eyes. A man finally at rest in his own home. And for the first time, the silence between them felt less like an absence of words, and more like the beginning of a conversation. The thaw came a week after the blizzard had ended. A slow, muddy affair that turned the frozen streets of Larkspur Hollow into a treacherous river of slush. With it came the first tendrils of news, carried by a trapper who'd seen smoke rising from the chimney of the Harlow ranch. Then, Jonas Harlow himself rode into town for supplies. He moved with the same forbidding silence as always. But this time, the townsfolk noticed something different, The slight, almost imperceptible limp was still there, but it was better, less pronounced than it had been a month ago. And he bought more than his usual share of flour, coffee, and beans. He bought enough for 2. He offered no explanation, and no one was brave enough to ask. But when he left, the questions began to bubble in his wake, fermenting into gossip in the warm, close air of the general store. Where in heaven's name has that nurse been, whispered Mrs. Henderson, the blacksmith's wife, to Martha Gable. Her room at your house has been empty since before the storm. We all thought she'd run off. Martha Gable, whose face held the grim satisfaction of someone whose darkest suspicions were being confirmed, sniffed loudly. She didn't run off. She was taken in. Harlow's horse was seen near the Calloway place the day she disappeared. He took her. The words hung in the air, ripe with insinuation. Taken her. The phrase could mean anything, but in the minds of the women gathered there, it painted a sordid picture. The quiet, strange nurse with the sad eyes and the reclusive, dangerous rancher who was more myth than man. It was a scandal, a dark romance, a horror story they could take their pick. The men in the saloon had a cruder take on it, their low chuckles and speculative wagers a testament to the harsh, unsentimental view of life on the frontier. May Whitlock, the fragile woman from the East, was now Jonas Harlow's property. When May finally rode into town 2 days later, the news of her arrival spread faster than a prairie fire. She rode a gentle mare that Jonas had given her for the purpose, her medical chest strapped behind the saddle. She had come for 2 reasons: to check on her patients on the outskirts of town, and to retrieve the rest of her belongings from the boarding house. As she dismounted in front of the establishment, the town seemed to hold its breath. Doors creaked open. Faces appeared in windows. The rhythmic clang of the blacksmith's hammer fell silent. May was aware of the eyes on her, 100 invisible needles pricking her skin. She kept her back straight, her chin high, and focused on the simple mechanics of tying the reins to the hitching post. Martha Gable was waiting for her on the porch, arms crossed over her formidable chest. Her expression was a mixture of accusation and righteous curiosity. "So," the older woman began, foregoing any greeting, "you're back. I've come for my things." "Mrs. Gable," May said, her voice calm and even. Folks were worried. Martha pressed on, her eyes sharp. "Worried what might have happened to you? Out there, with him asterisk." This was the moment. The confrontation she had known was coming. She could defend herself, explain the blizzard, the sick child, the injury. She could try to make them understand the quiet, decent man beneath the fearsome reputation. But she knew it would be useless. Her words would be just so much chaff in the wind, twisted and turned and disbelieved. They didn't want the truth. They wanted the story. So she gave them nothing. She looked directly at Martha Gable, her gaze clear and steady. "How is Mr. Gable's cough?" she asked. "With this thaw, the damp air can settle in the chest. I have a syrup of licorice root and honey that might bring him some ease." The question was so unexpected it completely disarmed the older woman. Martha blinked, her mouth opening and closing for a moment without a sound. Her husband's hacking cough was a constant, rattling presence in the boarding house, a source of both irritation and worry. It's bad in the mornings," she finally stammered, the fight going out of her. "I'll leave a jar for you," May said. She then walked past the stunned landlady and went up the stairs to her room, the eyes of the town following her every step. That single act set the tone for everything that followed. May Whitlock did not talk. She worked. She did not engage in gossip. She offered remedies. Her life at the Harlow Ranch remained a closed book, a subject of fevered speculation that she refused to acknowledge. Instead, she poured her energy into the town. Her first stop was the Calloway shack. Little Samuel, round-cheeked and healthy, ran out to greet her, his earlier, rasping cough now just a bad memory. His mother, Mary Calloway, wept with gratitude, pressing a small, lumpy loaf of bread into May's hands. "We thought we'd lost him," Mary whispered, her hand clutching May's arm. "And then we heard you were gone. We prayed for you." Miss, in the Calloway's eyes, May was not a fallen woman. She was the instrument of a miracle. From there, her work became a quiet, steady rhythm against the backdrop of the town's suspicion. She was called to the Henderson farm when the blacksmith, a large, powerful man, nearly severed 2 fingers with a misplaced blow of a hammer. He was a proud man, surly and dismissive of what he called women's fussing, but he watched, grunting in grudging respect, as May calmly and skillfully cleaned the wound, stitched the flesh back together with neat, precise movements, and bandaged the hand so expertly that he still had use of it. He never mentioned Jonas Harlow's name to her, but the next time she came to town, a new, sturdy iron handle had been fitted to her medical chest, a silent offering of payment and respect. She started spending 3 days a week in town, renting her old room from a now subdued Martha Gable. She set up a small clinic in the corner of the room, her bed pushed against one wall, a clean table and a chair. Her new office. People came hesitantly at first. A child with a fever, a woman with a blistering burn from a stove accident, an old man, Mr. Abernathy, whose joints ached with an agony that made the winters unbearable. For each, she had something to offer: a cool hand, a practiced eye, a tincture to ease pain, a salve to prevent scarring, a word of quiet comfort. She never asked for a set fee, accepting whatever people could offer: a sack of potatoes, a few jars of canned peaches, a mended dress. One afternoon, a young woman named Sarah, whose husband worked a small, unprofitable claim in the hills, came to her, her face pale with worry. She was new to motherhood, and her infant daughter had been crying inconsolably for a day and a night, a thin, wailing cry that tore at the heart. May went with her to the small, one-room cabin. She spent an hour there, not just examining the baby, but watching the mother. She showed Sarah how to better hold the child to ease the colic, made the young woman a cup of calming chamomile tea, and sat with her, speaking in low tones about the fears and exhaustion that came with a new baby. When she left, the infant was asleep, and the mother was weeping with sheer, unadulterated relief. The whispers about May and Jonas Harlow didn't stop. Not entirely, but they began to change. The tone shifted from scandalous speculation to a kind of mystified wonder. The woman who lived with the beast was the same woman who had saved the blacksmith's hand, who had sat with Sarah's crying baby, who brought a soothing soup to old Mr. Abernathy when he was too sore to cook for himself. The 2 images were impossible to reconcile. Slowly, inevitably, the work began to eclipse the gossip. Her value became more tangible than her story. She was no longer defined by where she slept at night, but by what she did during the day. She was not Harlow's woman. She was our nurse. The transition was subtle, marked by small moments. A nod from a group of men on the street instead of a sullen stare. An invitation to share a midday meal from Mrs. Henderson, a child running up to her and offering her a fistful of wildflowers. The true turning point came one dusty afternoon when Jonas rode into town. He still came for supplies, and his and May's unspoken arrangement was that he would often escort her part of the way back to the ranch, meeting her at an agreed-upon spot just north of town. As he was tying his horse outside the general store, a farmer, whose wife May had recently helped through a bout of lung fever, approached him. The man was nervous, twisting his hat in his hands, but determined. "Mr. Harlow," the farmer said, his voice a little too loud. Jonas turned, his face an impassive mask, his hand resting near the colt on his hip. The farmer swallowed hard. I just wanted to ask if you'd be so kind as to tell Miss Whitlock that my Clara is breathing easy now. The tea she made, it worked wonders, and to thank her." Jonas looked at the man, his gray eyes unblinking. The entire street seemed to be watching. He could have ignored him. He could have grunted and walked away, preserving the fearful distance he had cultivated for years. Instead, after a long moment, he gave a single, curt nod. "I'll tell her," he said. It was a simple exchange, but it was a profound shift. The farmer had not only acknowledged the connection between them, but had accepted it, used it. He had treated Jonas not as a monster, but as a messenger. That evening, as May rode beside Jonas on the trail back to the ranch, the setting sun painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, he relayed the farmer's message. He repeated the words verbatim, his voice a low, factual rumble. May didn't say anything for a long time, just watched the rhythmic gait of her horse. She had come to this place an exile, a fragile woman with a fractured past. The town had seen her as an oddity, a curiosity to be whispered about. But in their eyes, she was no longer strange. Through her work, through the simple, steady application of her skills and her compassion, she had become something else entirely. She had become necessary, and in that necessity, she was, for the first time in a very long time, beginning to feel whole. The seasons in that high country did not glide one into the next. They warred with each other. Autumn was a brief, golden truce before the long, tyrannical reign of winter, and winter itself was not a single, monolithic season, but a series of battles. There were the weeks of quiet, biting cold, and then there were the sudden, violent assaults of the blizzards. A routine had settled over the ranch, a quiet domesticity that May found both comforting and unnerving. Her life was now measured by two distinct rhythms, the busy, purposeful days she spent in town, and the slow, quiet evenings at the ranch. She, Jonas, and Silas had become a strange, silent constellation, each orbiting the others in a predictable, comforting pattern. Evenings were spent in the main room, the fire casting a warm glow on the dark wood. Silas would sit at the table, practicing his letters on a small slate. May would be in her chair, mending clothes or rolling bandages, the rhythmic pull of her needle a soothing sound in the quiet. Jonas would be at the other end of the table, cleaning a rifle or mending a piece of tack, his large hands surprisingly deft. They rarely spoke, but the silence was no longer empty. It was filled with a shared understanding, a sense of belonging that May had never thought she would feel again. She learned the language of his movements, the slight set of his jaw when he was worried about a horse, the almost imperceptible softening of his eyes when he watched Silas read. He, in turn, learned hers. He knew when her shoulders were tight with exhaustion from a long day in town, and a mug of hot tea would appear at her elbow without a word. It was on one such quiet evening that the world outside their small circle of lamplight decided to remind them of its power. A low moan of wind began to stir around the eaves of the house, a sound they had grown used to. But this was different. The moan grew to a shriek, and then to a deep, guttural roar, as if some great beast were trying to claw its way inside. The temperature plummeted. The very timbers of the house seemed to groan under the assault. Jonas rose from the table and went to the window, peering out into the swirling blackness. "This is a bad one," he said, his voice low and grim. "Came on faster than I've ever seen." May gathered Silas close, the boy's eyes wide with a mixture of fear and excitement. The wind was a physical thing now, a battering ram against the walls. A sudden, explosive crack, like a giant bone snapping, echoed from outside, followed by the high, terrified whinny of a horse. Jonas's head snapped up. His face, in the flickering lamplight, was a mask of alarm. "The east shed," he breathed. It was an older structure, a lean-to where he kept the yearlings, the young horses, not yet strong enough to endure the worst of the weather in the open. Before May could say a word, he was pulling on his heavy coat and boots. "Jonas, you can't," she pleaded, rising to her feet. "It's a white fury out there. You won't be able to see your own hand in front of your face. They'll be cut to pieces by the splintered wood or freeze before morning," he said, his voice flat and final. He was not asking for permission. He grabbed a lantern, But the flame immediately blew out as a gust of wind forced its way through a crack in the door frame. "No use," he grunted, tossing it aside. He would have to go by instinct alone. "Don't go," Silas cried, his voice trembling. Jonas paused at the door and looked at the boy. For a fleeting second, his hard expression softened. He gave a single, sharp nod, a silent promise to return. And then he opened the door and was swallowed by the screaming, swirling vortex of snow and darkness. The door slammed shut, and the sounds of the storm seemed to magnify, filling the room, filling May's head. She held Silas, murmuring reassurances she did not feel, her eyes fixed on the door. Every creak of the house, every shriek of the wind, was the sound of Jonas being torn apart. Minutes stretched into an eternity. 10 minutes, 15. The sounds from outside grew more desperate, the panicked screaming of the horses, the violent, wrenching sound of wood being torn apart. He was out there, fighting a battle he could not win. He was fighting the wind and the cold and the splintered timbers, a single man against the full, indifferent rage of nature. And May knew, with a sudden, gut-wrenching certainty, that his pride and his stubbornness would keep him out there until the storm took him. He would die for his horses. A cold dread, more chilling than the wind outside, washed over her. It was the old, familiar feeling of helplessness, of waiting for a terrible ending that was already written. She saw the silver scar on her wrist, a testament to what happened when you stood by and did nothing. "No, not again! Stay here!" she commanded Silas, her voice sharp with an urgency that made the boy freeze. "Do not open this door for any reason." She didn't grab her coat. She didn't take the time to find her shawl or her gloves. There was no time. In the space of a single heartbeat, her fear for him had burned away her own instinct for survival. She threw the door open and plunged into the maelstrom. The shock of it was breathtaking. The wind tore the air from her lungs, and the snow, hard and sharp as sand, blasted her skin, blinding her. She was in her simple wool dress, utterly defenseless against the storm's fury. She stumbled forward, her stockinged feet sinking into the deep, churning snow, the cold a searing pain. She screamed his name, but the sound was ripped from her lips and thrown away by the wind. Guided by the terrifying sounds of the panicked horses, she fought her way toward the remnants of the east shed. The structure had partially collapsed. Its roof slanted at a drunken angle. Timbers, sharp and broken, stuck out like broken bones. Through the blinding snow, she could make out a dark shape, Jonas, struggling to force a terrified yearling through a gap in the broken wall, trying to herd it toward the relative safety of the main barn. He was using his own body as a shield, pushing against the horse with one shoulder, his other arm raised to ward off a piece of roofing that was groaning and threatening to collapse entirely. He was a figure of impossible, desperate strength, a man trying to hold back the apocalypse with his bare hands, but he was losing. His movements were slowing, and she could see the exhaustion in the slump of his shoulders. "Jonas!" she screamed again, and this time, he seemed to hear her. He turned his head, his face a pale blur in the swirling snow. His eyes widened in disbelief and fury when he saw her. "Get back inside!" he roared, his voice barely audible over the storm. She ignored him. She scrambled forward, grabbing his arm. It was like grabbing an oak tree, solid and unmoving. "Let them go!" she cried, her voice raw. "They're not worth your life, come back." "I can't!" he yelled, turning back to the horse. "They'll die." "And you'll die with them!" she screamed, pulling at him with all her strength. "Silas needs you, we need you, come back." Her words, or perhaps the raw desperation in her voice, seemed to break through his stubborn resolve. He looked at her, standing in the heart of the blizzard with no coat, her hair wild, her face raw from the wind, her eyes pleading with him. He looked at the groaning roof above him, and at the terrified horses scattering into the white darkness. He had to make a choice. With a final, desperate shove, He sent the last yearling stumbling out into the open. Then he let his arms drop. He turned and grabbed May's hand, his grip like iron, and pulled her after him, fighting their way back toward the small, distant light of the house. They burst back inside, bringing the storm in with them, and slammed the door against the howling wind. They stood there in the middle of the room, gasping for breath, soaked and shivering, their chests heaving. Silas ran to Jonas, clinging to his leg, crying with relief. May leaned against the table, her body trembling uncontrollably, not just from the cold, but from the violent surge of adrenaline and the profound terror of what had almost happened. Jonas gently pried Silas off his leg and sent him to the fire. Then he turned to May. He saw her shaking hands, the knuckles white as she gripped the table for support. He walked over to her, his face grim, and took her hands in his. His were large and calloused, still cold from the storm, but they completely enveloped hers. He held them, waiting for the violent tremors to subside. "Don't do that again," he said, his voice a low, rough command. He looked down at her, and the anger in his eyes was mingled with something else, something raw and vulnerable. "Don't save me," he said, his voice dropping even lower. "If you're not ready to lose me." It was a warning, a challenge, a confession. He was telling her that to care for him was to accept the constant, looming possibility of his death. The land was hard, their life was dangerous, and he was a man who would always stand between that danger and what was his. May looked up at him, her trembling beginning to ease under the steady pressure of his hands. She thought of all the loss she had known, of the ghosts she had run from, and she realized, in that moment, that he was wrong. Her fear had changed. Her voice was a whisper, but it was clear and steady in the quiet room, an anchor against the storm still raging outside. "I'm not afraid of losing people anymore," she said, her eyes locked with his. "I'm just afraid of not being there when it happens." The truth of her words settled between them, profound and absolute. She was not afraid of the end. She was only afraid of the lonely vigil, of not being there to offer a hand to hold in the darkness. It was the ultimate vow, a promise not of forever, but of presence, of staying, no matter the cost. Jonas stared down at her, and she saw the last of his walls crumble. He had offered her the hard truth of his world, and she had met it with an even harder truth of her own. He tightened his grip on her hands, his thumbs gently stroking the backs of them. The warmth from his skin began to seep into hers, a slow, steady tide against the cold. The storm howled, but inside the small cabin, a new and profound silence had fallen. A silence that was no longer about things left unsaid, but about everything finally being understood. In the days that followed the storm, a profound quiet settled over the ranch, a stillness that was deeper than the blanket of snow covering the world. The violence of the blizzard had scoured the air clean, and the sky that emerged was a high, crystalline blue. It was as if the storm had not been an ending, but a scouring, stripping away everything that was not essential, leaving only a stark and silent truth. The unspoken confessions made in the heart of that storm had altered the very atmosphere between them. The silence was different now. It was no longer a space between two solitary people, but a shared territory, a language of its own. It was in the way Jonas would watch her across the room, his gaze lingering for a moment longer than it used to. It was in the way she would set a plate of food before him, her hand brushing his ever so slightly, a touch that was no longer accidental. They moved around each other with a new, quiet grace, their orbits now intrinsically linked. Their life together found its rhythm. May continued her work in town, but the ranch was now her anchor, the place she returned to not just for shelter, but for a sense of peace she had never known. Jonas's leg healed, the limp fading until it was only a memory. Silas, healthy and bright, was the cheerful center of their small universe, his laughter filling the quiet corners of the house. He had taken to calling May Aunt May for good now, and the name, Once a delirious mistake, now felt as natural as breathing. It was a cold, clear afternoon. A week or so after the storm, Jonas was finally clearing out the last of the wreckage from the east shed. In the process, he had brought a small, dust-covered wooden chest into the house. It had belonged to his sister, Silas's mother, and it held the few precious things she had left behind. He placed it on the table and opened the lid. A faint scent of lavender and old paper drifted out. Inside were a few tintype photographs, a small, worn Bible, a lock of baby hair tied with a blue ribbon, and a stack of letters. May, who had been grinding coffee beans by the hearth, stopped what she was doing, sensing the sacredness of the moment. She would not intrude on his private grief. Jonas sorted through the contents with a slow, careful reverence. He paused on a photograph of a woman with his same gray eyes and a gentle smile, his expression unreadable. Then his fingers found something that was not his sister's. Tucked at the very bottom was a single, folded sheet of foolscap, yellowed at the edges. It was his own handwriting, strong and dark. He pulled it out and held it for a long moment, staring at it as if it were a ghost. He ran his thumb along the crease. May could feel the tension in him, a sudden return of the guarded stillness she had first encountered. He looked up, and his eyes met hers across the room. The air grew thick with unspoken things. He didn't say a word. He simply rose from the bench, walked over to where she stood, and placed the folded paper on the small table beside her. Then, without another glance, he turned, pulled on his coat, and went back outside, leaving her alone with his silence and his past. Her hands trembled slightly as she picked it up. The paper was heavy. The ink faded in places. There was no name on the outside. She unfolded it carefully. At the top was a date, written nearly a year ago, long before she had ever heard the name Larkspur Hollow. It was not a letter to anyone. She realized it was a letter to no one, a message sent out into the void. She began to read. Asterisk. There are wounds a bandage cannot fix. It began. Asterisk. The doctors in the war could set a bone or stitch a torn muscle. They had laudanum for the pain you could point to, but they have no medicine for the wound a man gets in his soul. It is a hollow place that lets the cold in. People try to fill it with noise. They talk and they preach and they judge. Their words are like salt on the raw flesh. They think a man who is quiet is a man who is broken, or a man who is mean. They do not understand that silence is the only clean thing left. Asterisk, I have spent years building a wall against the noise. My horses understand it. The wind understands it. They do not demand reasons. They do not offer pity. They simply are. They exist in the hard truth of things. And that is a comfort. Asterisk. But the hollow place remains, sometimes at night. When the wind dies down, the silence becomes too loud. It is in those moments a man wonders if there is a cure at all. Asterisk. If there is, it would not come from a doctor with a bag full of pills, or a preacher with a book full of promises. It would have to be something else. It would have to be someone. Someone who understands that some hurts are too deep for words. Someone whose hands know how to be silent, who can sit with a man in his darkness without needing to light a lamp. Asterisk. The world is full of people who look at you and see only what you have done, the stories they tell about you, the mistakes you have made. I think if a man is ever to be healed, it will be by someone whose eyes do not judge, someone who looks at a ruin and sees not the broken stones, but the house that once stood there, and the home it could be again. That is the only medicine, a quiet presence, a steady gaze, the kind of peace that does not need to be spoken to be felt. May read the last line, and then read the whole thing over again. Her heart ached with a feeling so profound she could not put a name to it. This was the man beneath the legend, the soul inside the silent fortress. This was the truth of Jonas Harlow, written in a moment of deep, solitary despair, a truth he never intended for anyone to see. and in his description of a nameless, faceless healer. He had, without knowing it, described her. He had described the woman she had become not by choice, but by necessity, forged in the fires of her own loss. Her own hands had learned to be silent because words had failed her. Her own eyes had learned not to judge because she knew the terrible weight of being misjudged. She carefully folded the letter along its original creases and placed it back on the table. He had laid his soul bare for her. He had given her the key to the last locked room inside of him. And she knew, with absolute certainty, that any words she could offer in return would be clumsy and inadequate. To speak would be to misunderstand the very essence of his confession. His letter was a prayer for silence. Her answer would be the same. The rest of the day passed in a gentle quiet. When Jonas returned, he did not look at the letter, and he did not look at her. He simply went about his evening chores, the tension gone from his shoulders. He had made his offering. The rest was up to her. That night, May lay awake in her small room, the words of the letter echoing in her mind. Asterisk. A quiet presence, a steady gaze. She thought of his vow in the lamplight. Asterisk. With me. Asterisk. And her own whispered confession in the aftermath of the storm. They had been circling this truth for months, speaking it in every language but words. The house was still. The only sound was the low, steady breathing of Silas from his room and the soft sigh of the embers in the hearth. She rose from her bed, her bare feet silent on the cold wooden floorboards. She crept into the main room. Jonas was not in his own bed. He had fallen asleep in the large chair by the dying fire, a heavy blanket pulled over him, the rifle resting against the wall beside him. He was on watch, even in his sleep, a guardian by nature. His face, in the soft, red glow of the embers, was unguarded. The harsh lines were softened, and he looked younger, more vulnerable. The formidable rancher was gone, and in his place was just a man, asleep and at peace. She knelt beside his chair, her heart beating a slow, heavy rhythm in her chest. She looked at his face, at the strong column of his throat, at the broad expanse of his chest rising and falling with each breath. This was her answer. Slowly, she reached out and laid her hand flat against his chest, directly over his heart, through the rough wool of his shirt. She could feel it, the solid warmth of him, and beneath that, the steady, powerful, thumping beat of his life. Asterisk, thump, 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 thump. It was the most honest sound in the world, a rhythm of strength and survival and profound, unspoken feeling. It was the sound of the hollow place being filled. He stirred in his sleep, a low murmur in his throat. His own hand, large and calloused, came up and covered hers, pressing it tighter against him. He did not wake, but in that unconscious gesture, he accepted her silent reply. He had shown her the wound in his soul, and she, in turn, had shown him that she was not afraid to touch it, to feel the very beat of it, and to stay. The spring that followed the long winter was a revelation. As the snow receded, it unveiled a land that was not brown and barren, but teeming with a fierce, fragile life. Patches of Indian paintbrush and bluebonnets appeared like thrown jewels against the greening hills. The air, once sharp and sterile, was now soft and filled with the scent of damp earth and new beginnings. It was a season of rebuilding, both for the land and for the people who lived on it. The silent understanding that had been forged between May and Jonas in the heart of winter now moved out into the light. Their life settled into a new kind of normal, a partnership that was as solid and unspoken as the mountains on the horizon. He ran his ranch, and she tended to her town, and in the evenings, they returned to each other, their shared silence a sanctuary. But May's work in town was growing. The small room at Martha Gable's boarding house was no longer sufficient. It was cramped and dark, and on the days she held her clinic, a line of patients would often spill out into the hallway, their coughs and quiet conversations a disruption to the other boarders. The breaking point came during a brief but vicious outbreak of summer fever that swept through the settlement's children. May found herself trying to tend to 3 feverish, crying children and their anxious mothers in a space no bigger than a pantry. It was chaotic, unprofessional, and unsafe. She knew something had to change. There was an old, abandoned building at the end of the main street. It had once been an assay office during a brief, hopeful gold rush years ago. But now it stood empty, its windows boarded up, its sign faded to illegibility. It was small, just a single room with a storage space in the back, but it was solid, and most importantly, it was available. Mr. Henderson, the owner of the general store, held the deed. May approached him one afternoon, her proposal carefully thought out. She didn't have much money for rent, but she could offer her services in trade for his family's care for the year. The storekeeper, a practical man whose wife and children May had treated on more than one occasion, listened thoughtfully, stroking his beard. He looked at May, at her steady eyes and capable hands, and saw the value in her offer. He agreed, handing her the rusty old key. That evening, back at the ranch, May told Jonas about the building. She described it to him as she sat by the fire, mending one of Silas's shirts. She spoke of her plans in a low, practical voice, sketching out her ideas for shelves, a clean table for examinations, and benches for people to wait on. She spoke of it as her project, a challenge she was ready to undertake alone. She expected him to listen, to nod, perhaps to offer a word of encouragement. She did not ask for his help. Jonas sat across from her, oiling a bridle, his head bent over his work. He listened without interruption until she had finished. He didn't say anything for a long time. Then, he carefully set his tools aside, wiped his hands on a rag, and looked directly at her. "The floorboards will need to be replaced near the south wall," he said, his voice a low rumble. "The runoff from the hill will have rotted them. The window frames will need to be rebuilt, and you'll need a new door, one that fits tight against the wind." May stared at him. He wasn't just listening. He had been inside the building before. He knew its flaws, its weaknesses. He spoke of it as if the decision were already made, as if her problem was now his problem. The next morning, he rode into town with her. He did not go to the general store for supplies. He went to the blacksmith, and then to the small lumber mill at the edge of town. He returned to the old assay office, where May was struggling to sweep away years of dust and grime. With a wagon loaded with fresh-cut pine boards, a box of nails, and his own formidable collection of tools, he didn't ask her where to begin. He simply walked into the derelict building, dropped his toolbox with a solid thud, and began to work. And so, the rebuilding began. For the next 2 weeks, the sound of Jonas Harlow's hammer became a new rhythm in the life of Larkspur Hollow. It was a steady, purposeful sound that started shortly after dawn and ended only when the light began to fail. The town watched, mesmerized. Jonas was a known recluse, a man who barely tolerated the town's existence. Now, here he was, in the heart of it, working with a silent, focused intensity that was both awesome and terrifying. He and May worked side by side, their partnership a silent, seamless choreography. He was the brute force and the master craftsman. He tore out the rotten floorboards with a single, powerful wrench of a crowbar. He measured and cut the new pine with a smooth, practiced efficiency, the boards fitting together so perfectly there was not a crack between them. He built a new door from scratch, reinforcing it with iron hinges he'd had the blacksmith forge. He constructed a long, sturdy workbench against one wall that would serve as May's examination table, sanding the surface until it was as smooth as polished stone. He built shelves, dozens of them, each one level and strong, ready for her bottles and bandages. May was the heart and the vision of the project. While he built, she cleaned. She scrubbed the years of dirt from the walls, then applied a coat of whitewash, the clean, bright paint transforming the dingy space. She reglazed the new window panes he fitted, her small, careful movements a counterpoint to his broad, powerful ones. She sewed curtains from simple muslin, a touch of softness in the practical, clean space. They rarely spoke. There was no need. He would hold up a board, and she would nod if the length was right. She would point to a wall, and he would understand that was where the shelves needed to be. He would finish a piece of work, and she would be there with a rag to wipe away the sawdust. It was a communication more intimate than any conversation. They were not just repairing a building. They were weaving the threads of their lives together, their shared labor a testament to their bond. The townspeople kept their distance at first, watching from across the street, whispering amongst themselves. They saw the reclusive rancher on his knees, hammering nails for the quiet nurse. They saw her bring him a tin cup of water in the heat of the day, saw the way he would stop his work and watch her for a moment as she swept the floor. No one dared ask about their arrangement. The questions that had once been so urgent, was she his captive? His mistress now seemed absurd. The answer was right there in front of them, in the solid set of the new door, in the clean lines of the shelves, in the shared sweat and sawdust. You did not build a thing like this with a person you did not honor. Slowly, the town began to participate. The blacksmith, Mr. Henderson, appeared one day with a small, efficient-looking wood stove. "For the winter," he grunted, refusing any payment. "A place like this needs good heat." Mary Calloway and some of the other women from the outskirts of town brought jars of wildflowers to set on the new windowsills. Even Martha Gable stopped by, a basket of freshly baked bread in her hands, her expression one of grudging, undeniable respect. They did not call themselves husband and wife. They did not need the words, the ceremony, the piece of paper. The entire town could see what they were. They were partners. They were a unit. They were two solitary, broken people who had found a way to build something whole together. The clinic was not just a room for healing the town's sick. It was the first room of the home they were building for their own souls. On the last day, when the final bench was in place and the last jar of salve was set upon its shelf, May and Jonas stood together in the doorway, looking at what they had made. The late afternoon sun streamed through the clean windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The room smelled of fresh-cut pine, of whitewash, and of new beginnings. It was quiet, clean, and hopeful. May looked from the sturdy table to the solid shelves to the perfectly fitted door. Every piece of it was a testament to his care, to his silent devotion. She looked at Jonas, at his strong, capable hands, now resting on his hips, and her heart was so full it felt like it might break. He turned his head and looked down at her, a question in his eyes. Was it what she wanted? May didn't answer with words. She simply reached out, took his large, calloused hand, and squeezed it. It was all the thanks he needed. They stood there for a long moment, hand in hand, two shadows in the doorway of the house they had built together, ready for whatever came next. The late summer settled into a season of quiet grace. The clinic in Larkspur Hollow became the town's new heart, a place of clean order and quiet hope. May's days were full, a steady rhythm of work that was both demanding and deeply satisfying. She was no longer the quiet nurse whispered about in hushed tones. She was simply May, a fixed point in the lives of the townspeople. The past, with its sharp edges and haunting shadows, had finally begun to feel distant, a story that had happened to someone else. Her life at the ranch was the anchor for this new reality. The peace she found there was a tangible thing, something she could feel in the solid walls of the house, in the vast, silent sweep of the plains, and in the steady, unassuming presence of the man who shared it with her. The bond between her and Jonas was no longer a fragile, nascent thing, but a deep, solid foundation upon which they had both, without ever speaking of it, begun to build their lives. This fragile peace was shattered on a Tuesday afternoon, when the air was hot and still. Mrs. Henderson came rushing into the clinic, her face pale and her hands fluttering with agitation. "May," she said, her voice a tense whisper. "There's a man in town, a stranger. He's asking for you." May was cleaning her instruments, her hands steady. "Many people ask for me. Eleanor, what's the trouble?" "No, not like that. Mrs." Henderson insisted. "He's different, dressed in fine Eastern clothes, riding a thoroughbred. He's staying at the saloon, asking questions. He asked for Miss Maeve Whitlock." May froze, the instrument slipping from her fingers and clattering onto the wooden table. Maeve. No one had called her that in years. It was a name that belonged to another life, another person, a younger, more frightened version of herself. A cold dread, a feeling she had thought long buried, began to uncoil in the pit of her stomach. Her right hand moved instinctively to her left wrist, her thumb tracing the faint silver line of the scar hidden beneath her sleeve. "What does he look like?" May asked, her own voice sounding distant to her ears. "Tall, dark hair, clean-shaven. Mrs." Henderson said, watching her with worried eyes. "He has a way about him, like he owns whatever he looks at." May closed her eyes. The image was immediate, visceral. Caleb Thorne. The name itself felt like a violation in this clean, quiet room she had built. He was the ghost she had outrun, the architect of the wound she carried, both on her skin and in her soul. He was a man who saw the world not in terms of people, but of possessions. And she had once been his most prized and most broken possession. "Thank you for telling me." "Eleanor," May said, her voice regaining its steadiness through a sheer act of will. She opened her eyes. The fear was still there, a cold sickness in her veins. But something else rose to meet it, a hard, stubborn resolve she did not know she possessed until that moment. She finished her work, her movements precise and automatic. She treated a child's bee sting and gave Mr. Abernathy a new jar of liniment for his arthritis. But with every patient, her mind was racing. What did he want? The answer was simple and terrifying. Caleb did not believe in letting things go. He believed in ownership. He had come to reclaim what he saw as his. When the last patient was gone, she locked the door to the clinic and untied her mare. The ride back to the ranch was the longest of her life. The familiar landscape, usually a source of comfort, now seemed alien and menacing. Every shadow could be him. Every gust of wind seemed to whisper his name. The old fear was a powerful current, threatening to pull her under, telling her to run, to ride past the ranch and keep going, to disappear as she had before. But then she thought of the blizzard, of her hands holding back a man as stubborn as the storm itself. She thought of a quiet, unsent letter that had described her soul without ever knowing her name. She thought of a solid, steady heartbeat felt in the dark. This was her home now. And you did not run from your home. When she rode into the yard, Jonas was on the porch, mending a saddle. He looked up as she dismounted, and he knew instantly. Her face was a pale, tight mask. He didn't have to see the fear in her eyes to feel the terror that radiated from her. He set his work aside and rose to his feet. A silent, looming question. "Trouble?" he asked, his voice low. May could only nod, her throat too tight for words. "Town trouble," he pressed. "My trouble," she whispered, and the words seemed to unlock the paralysis that held her. "From before. A man. He's come for me." Jonas didn't ask for details. He didn't need the man's name or the history of their shared past. He saw the faint, silver scar on her wrist, which she was unconsciously rubbing. And he understood. This was the source of the shadows he had seen in her eyes, the ghost that sometimes made her tremble in her sleep. His face, already hard, settled into lines of granite. He didn't speak. He simply went back inside the house and returned a moment later. Buckling on the worn leather gun belt that held his Colt, he checked the action of the pistol, a single metallic click in the quiet air. And then he let it rest on his hip. He stood on the porch, his feet planted slightly apart, and he waited. They didn't have to wait long. As the sun began to dip toward the mountains, casting long, dramatic shadows across the yard, a rider appeared. It was Caleb Thorne, just as Mrs. Henderson had described. He sat his expensive horse with an easy, arrogant grace, his tailored coat and polished boots a stark contrast to the rugged landscape. He looked from the sturdy, unadorned ranch house to the silent, formidable man standing on the porch, and a slow, condescending smile spread across his face. He ignored Jonas completely, his eyes fixing on May, who stood just behind the rancher's shoulder. "Maeve, my dear," he said, his voice smooth and cultured, a sound that was utterly alien here. "It took me a great deal of effort to find you in this God-forsaken wilderness. I've come to take you home." Jonas didn't move a muscle. His hand rested on the porch railing, inches from the worn handle of his pistol. His presence was a solid, unmoving wall. May felt a tremor of the old fear. Caleb's voice was a key that threatened to unlock the cage she had built around her past self. She could feel her own history, a story of his smooth words and quiet threats, of his possessive grip and the final, terrible night that had given her the scar. Caleb's eyes flicked to Jonas, a dismissive, sizing-up glance. "I'm sure this gentleman has provided you with adequate shelter, but it's time to return to civilization. Your place is with me." He spoke of her as if she were a runaway horse he had finally tracked down. This was the moment, the confrontation between her past and her present, between the woman she had been and the woman she had become. Slowly, deliberately, May stepped out from behind Jonas. She moved to stand beside him, not behind him. She was not seeking his protection. She was claiming her position. This was her home, and he was her partner, and they would face this together. Caleb's smile faltered for a second. He was looking at her, but he was not seeing the timid, frightened girl he remembered. He was seeing a woman whose shoulders were straight, whose hands were steady at her sides, and whose face held none of the tearful pleading he had expected. "Maeve, don't be foolish," he said, his smooth tone hardening slightly. "This is no life for you. I'm prepared to be forgiving. Now, come along." May looked at him. She saw the handsome face, the expensive clothes, the air of cultured superiority. But for the first time, she saw what lay beneath it, a hollow, grasping need. His power was not his own. It was a parasite that fed on the fear of others. And she was done being his host. She met his gaze, and the eyes that looked back at him were not the ones he remembered. They were not filled with fear or tears or pain. They were the cool, assessing eyes of a nurse who had looked into the face of death and infection and had not flinched. They were the steady, resolute eyes of a woman who had run out into a blizzard to save a life. They held no hatred for him. They held no anger. They held nothing at all. It was the calm, clear, and utter dismissal of a person looking at something that had ceased to matter. "My name," she said, her voice low and clear, carrying easily in the still air, "is May, and I am home." That was all. Caleb stared at her, searching for the weakness he had always been able to exploit, the crack in her resolve he could pry open. He found nothing. He was faced with a stranger, a woman he did not know and could not comprehend. Her lack of fear unnerved him, stripped him of his power. His gaze shifted to Jonas, to the silent, waiting figure whose hand now rested lightly, almost casually, on the butt of his Colt. He saw no anger in the rancher's face either, just a flat, patient certainty. It was the look of a man who was not hoping for a fight, but who would end one with absolute finality if it began. The civilized man from the East was a bully and a coward. He had come expecting to retrieve a broken thing. Instead, he had found two whole, unbreakable people. There was nothing for him here, no fear to feed on, no weakness to exploit, only the terrifying, combined strength of two silent souls who had found their home in each other. A flicker of rage crossed Caleb's face. followed by the bitter frustration of defeat. He gave a short, ugly laugh. He pulled on his reins, turning his horse in a tight, aggressive circle. "Have it your way," he spat. "Enjoy the dirt." And with that, he spurred his horse and rode away, a dark, diminishing figure against the blood-red sunset. He did not look back. The sound of his horse's hoofbeats faded, leaving behind a profound and ringing silence. The ghost had been faced. The old curse was broken. Jonas's hand relaxed, his fingers uncurling from their position near his gun. He turned his head and looked at May. His gray eyes were filled with a deep, quiet respect that was more powerful than any declaration of love. He had seen her fight her own battle, not with a weapon, but with the pure, unshakable force of her own spirit. And he had seen her win. May let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her body still trembled with the aftermath of the confrontation. Her hand went to her wrist, and her fingers gently touched the silver scar. It no longer felt like a brand of shame. It felt like a line in a story, the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. It was a part of her, a mark of survival that had led her here, to this man, to this life. Jonas reached out and took her hand, the one with the scar. He didn't say a word. He simply held it, his thumb stroking gently over the healed flesh. And in that silent, steady touch, everything was said. The past was laid to rest. The future was secure. Their home was safe. The world was holding its breath, caught in the liminal space between two seasons. Outside the ranch house window, the last of the great snows was surrendering. The process was not a quiet melt, but a symphony of drips and trickles, a constant, gentle percussion on the roof and against the window panes. A Chinook wind, warm and smelling of distant earth, was moving through the high country, whispering promises of spring. It was the final night of winter's siege, the eve of its unconditional surrender. May stood before the window, her forehead resting against the cool glass. The panes were fogged with her breath, blurring the moonlit landscape of decaying snow and emerging darkness. In the reflection, she could see the soft, golden glow of the room behind her, a stark contrast to the vast, uncertain world outside. She had placed the oil lamp on the floor, as she often did. Its light turned low. She preferred the soft, indirect glow, the way it made the room a sanctuary of warm shadows rather than a starkly lit stage. Behind her, Jonas sat in his chair by the hearth. The fire burned down to a bed of pulsing, red-gold embers. He was a silent, solid presence at her back, a mountain of quiet strength that had become the bedrock of her world. He held a steaming mug of tea in his hands, the faint, herbal scent of it a familiar part of their evenings. He wasn't reading or working. He was simply sitting, watching the fire. His presence a form of quiet conversation. So much had happened within these walls. May traced a small circle on the fogged glass, her finger following a rivulet of condensation. She had arrived here as a piece of driftwood, tossed by a storm she thought had destroyed her, landing on a shore she never knew existed. She had been Maeve, a name that tasted of fear and regret, a name that belonged to a woman who had let her own light be extinguished by a man who fed on darkness. The confrontation with Caleb Thorne had been the final test. The ghost from her past had ridden into her present, expecting to find the same broken creature he had left behind. But he had found a stranger. He had found May. He had found a woman who stood not behind, but beside. A man who met the world with a silence more powerful than any threat. The memory did not bring fear now, only a quiet, profound sense of finality. The last chain had been broken. And yet, a new fear had taken root, one more subtle and perhaps more terrifying than the old one. The fear of having something to lose. She had spent so long with nothing, her only possession a medical chest and a scar, that this newfound abundance of peace felt fragile, unreal. She had a home. She had a purpose. She had Silas, whose bright, innocent love was a constant, warming flame in the house. And she had Jonas. She had a life that was quiet and real, built not on grand declarations but on small, steady acts, a repaired floorboard, a shared meal, a hand held in the heart of a storm. It was a life illuminated by a single, precious light, and the vast darkness that surrounded it seemed to press in from all sides, a constant threat. She had seen how quickly things could be taken away. She had seen how a life could be shattered in a single night. This happiness, this sense of safety, felt like a candle flame in a high wind, beautiful and brilliant, but terrifyingly vulnerable. "I'm afraid," she said, her voice so soft it was almost a part of the wind's low sigh outside. She didn't turn from the window. She continued to stare out at the thawing world, at the stark, black shapes of the corrals and the barn against the snow. "I'm afraid the light will go out." She was not speaking of the oil lamp on the floor. He knew that. She was speaking of the fragile, beautiful thing they had built together in this wilderness. She was confessing the deepest fear of a heart that had finally found a safe harbor, the fear that the tide would turn, that the storm would return and wash it all away. She was afraid that the darkness she had known for so long was her natural state, and that this light was only a temporary reprieve. Behind her, the old wooden chair creaked as Jonas leaned forward. He set his mug down on the hearth with a soft click. He didn't rise. He didn't come to her. He remained where he was, a fixed point in the room, her anchor. His voice, when he spoke, was a low, steady rumble, as solid and dependable as the log walls of the house. It held no false promises, no easy comforts. It held only the simple, unadorned truth of his own nature. "Then I'll light it again," he said, "every time it does." The words settled over her, not like a soft blanket, but like a shield. He was not promising that the darkness would never come. He was not pretending that their life would be free of hardship or sorrow. He was a man of the frontier. He knew that the wind would always blow, that storms would always gather. He was simply vowing that he would be there, that every time the light flickered, or faltered, or was extinguished by the gales of life, he would be there with a match and a steady hand. He would be there to meet the darkness with her, and to patiently, stubbornly, light the lamp again. It was the most profound promise he could make, the only one that truly mattered. A single tear traced a path down May's cheek, but it was not a tear of sadness. It was a tear of release, of a final, deep-seated fear washing away. She turned from the window, her back to the dark, thawing world, and faced the warm, quiet heart of her home. She looked at him, at this silent, solitary man who had shown her the true meaning of safety, not as an absence of danger, but as the presence of an unwavering ally. She nodded, a small, simple gesture of acceptance. His vow was received, and hers was given in return. She walked the few steps across the room and knelt before his chair, just as she had on that night so long ago. She rested her head against his knee for a moment, a silent gesture of trust and belonging. Then she reached up and placed her hand flat against his chest. Asterisk, thump, 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 thump. There it was, the steady, powerful beat of his heart, the truest sound she knew. It was the rhythm of their life, the silent percussion that underscored every quiet moment, every shared glance, every trial they had faced together. It was the sound of his promise, the beat of a heart that would not falter. It was the sound of home. He placed his own large, warm hand over hers, holding it there, against the source of that steady rhythm. The embers in the hearth glowed. The wind whispered its promises of spring. And in the quiet, lamplit room, no one said anything more. There was nothing left to say. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We'd love to know where you're listening from, so please leave a comment below to connect with us and share your thoughts. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and like this video. If you'd like to support us further, please hit the hype button to help this story be heard by many more people.